No, it's 4 hours today. And it's like 4:15.
So let's return to our central theme. Our central theme is the relation of law and legal thought to institutional structure. And as always, I'm going to proceed in stages and steps. Moving from inside legal thought to outside of it today. So the single most striking substantive difference between law and legal thought in the 19th century and law and legal thought in the 20th is that the 20th century idea was that there was a certain system of rules and rights, which by definition, in its very nature, represented the institutional character of a free society, which is sometimes called a scheme of ordered liberty. And what was above all necessary, urgent, according to this conception, was to preserve this scheme of ordered liberty, this system of rules and rights, against perversion or contamination. For example, if a certain group in society acquired the power of the state and used this state power to advantage itself, redistributing resources to itself, and eroding the impersonal order of coordination in society. 20th century legal thought and law came to think that that's not enough. It's not enough dogmatically to define the rules and rights that represent, as it were, the constitution of liberty. It's necessary to ask whether the practical conditions for the effective enjoyment of these rights are fulfilled. So according to this new idea, introduced in the 20th century, the exercise of rights rests on defeasible factual conditions. That is, factual conditions that may fail. And all of law came to be reorganized dialectically in the light of this conception as an interplay between the rules and rights defining individual and collective self-determination, and the rules and rights that were designed to ensure the conditions for the practical efficacy and enjoyment of those rules and rights of self-determination. And that happened both locally and systemically in the whole of law. Yes?
You said interplay of rules and rights with self-determination.
Yes, so self-determination can be individual self-determination, as in contract, freedom of contract, or it can be collective self-determination, as in democracy. But these rules and rights that constitute self-determination, according to the 20th century view, depend on practical conditions for the effective enjoyment of the rights. So law then has to have these two parts. The part that defines the form of self-determination, individual and collective, and the part that is designed to ensure that these promises of rights of self-determination, will not be a sham. So it's like Anatole France's remark that the rich and the poor alike have freedom to sleep under the bridge. So, and in an employment contract where there's radically unequal bargaining power between the two sides, the form of contract may be reduced to a sham. It may be an empty shell It may be an empty shell because the reality of contract will be eviscerated by the fact of unequal bargaining power. Those became the characteristic concerns of 20th century law and legal thought. So it happened within particular branches of law. For example, within contract law, the relation between the rules governing contract formation, offer and acceptance and so forth, and the rules having to do with unconscionability and economic duress. It happened in the relation between two branches of law, such as the relation between contract law and labor law, the law of collective bargaining. So the law of collective bargaining was conceived as a device of countervailing power by which to reestablish the reality of contract in the setting of the employment relation, where there is radically unequal bargaining power, so that contract would not be a sham, so that it would be for real. And it happened at the most general level in the whole relation between public law and private law. So I said that one of the characteristics of the transformation of law in the 20th century is that a new body of public law, the law of the regulatory and redistributive state, was superimposed on a largely untransformed inherited body of private law. So the public law was seen as having as one of its chief missions to assure the reality or the practical enjoyment of those rights promised in private law. So this is a profound transformation. It had a general organizing influence on all of law and all of legal thought. Now, there was a limit to it. And the limit was that the 20th century introduced the notion that the exercise of rights, especially these rights of self-determination, individual or collective, depends, as I said, on practical conditions, which may fail. But it didn't take the next step. Now, what would have been the next step? What would have been the next step is to see how there could be plurality in the way of organizing the system of freedom. Economic, political, and social pluralism could take different institutional forms. So if you radicalize that idea, the idea which was not developed in the 20th century, you would say the forms of democracy, political pluralism, of the market order, economic pluralism, and of an independent civil society, social pluralism, are a subset of a much larger universe of possible legal institutional forms of political, economic, and social pluralism. And one might come to think that our ability to solve the structural problems of the contemporary societies depends on traveling in some other part of this universe of the possible forms of economic, political, and social pluralism. Now I want to focus on a particular legal problem or legal development that highlights the significance of both this advance and the point at which the advance stopped. As I said, it did this, it raised the question of the practical exercise of rights, but it stopped. It stopped before it reached the pluralism, the diversity of the institutional forms. It didn't advance to the next frontier. And here's then the question. So, law comes to be thought of, this rational reconstruction of law, purposive, idealizing, and systematizing. It's this purposive, policy-oriented, and principle-based style of legal reasoning, which we discussed in our previous meetings. And once law is thought in this ambitious way, intellectually ambitious, the possibility arises that there can be a conflict between the ideals that we impute to the law and describe in the language of policy and principles, and the character of particular social organizations or areas of social practice. So, for example, we may impute to the law, to large branches of law, an anti-subjugation ideal. And we may describe this anti-subjugation ideal in detail in the language of policy and principle. And then particular areas of social practice or social organization may come into conflict with this ideal that we impute to the law. So our conception is morally or politically ambitious because we see the law as not just a dumb, haphazard set of rules, but as a flawed plan, an intelligible, defensible plan of social life, a repository of principles and policies. And that idealizing way of thinking about the law creates then this possibility that the law can come into conflict with how things are organized in particular organizations, in particular areas of social practice. So there then arises a new form of adjudication. And the particular example that I want to focus on is what has been called in American practice complex enforcement or the structural injunctions. So we can compare now two forms of adjudication, the traditional form and this new form. In the traditional form, the litigants in principle are individual parties. In the new form, the litigants in principle are collective agents, or at least one side is. And so a traditional expression of this are class action lawsuits. Now, second, in the traditional form of adjudication, the wrong that has to be redressed is some violation of right. The zone of entitlement of rights is transgressed in some way. In the new form of adjudication, the wrong that has to be redressed is an insult to the ability practically to enjoy or to exercise the rights of self-determination. So there's something about that particular area of social practice or that particular social organization that undermines the reality of this self-determination, of this ideal that we're imputing to the law. And now comes the most important difference, the third difference between the traditional form of litigation and the one that is prefigured in this new practice of complex enforcement or of the structural injunctions. In the traditional form of adjudication, the remedy for the evil, for the wrong, is to restore the status quo ante and to grant some form of redress, of retribution or compensation or restitution that reestablishes the pre-existing assignment of rights. But now in the new form of litigation, as we have it in the structural injunctions or in so-called complex enforcement, the redress requires the adjudicator to reorganize a particular organization or a particular area of social practice in order to remove the insult to the practical enjoyment of the right. So the intervention involves some invasion of the causal background of social life. And it has the unique character of being both localized or episodic, but also structural. It is a reorganization. It's not just a reaffirmation of a previous assignment of rights. So where does this happen in the American practice? It happens with respect to prisons or mental asylums or school systems. So there's a particular area of social practice which is viewed as being in contradiction to those ideals that are imputed to the law. And the contradiction has to be resolved. Yes?
Sorry, I'm not really understanding why school and prisons are reorganizations.
Well, let me go a little further. So I gave you the example of where this practice is used. So it's used in particular organizations that are seen as offending in some way the practical exercise of rights. Because, for example, there may be discrimination. There may be racial discrimination. There may be a failure to respect some basic human right in the prison or in the mental asylum and so forth. So, characteristically, it's a variant of an anti-subjugation ideal. We would generalize it in that way. And it's said that this particular area of social practice violates that ideal. So I said that of these three contrasts that I suggested between the traditional adjudication and this new form of adjudication, the most novel, the richest, is the third. Because the remedy for the evil is not just the reestablishment of the status quo ante, of a pre-established assignment of rights. It's some reshaping of a particular organization or of a particular area of social practice. Now, what happened in the United States is that the agent of this new practice for redressing an evil that is both structural and localized turned out to be the judiciary, especially the federal judiciary. Now, if you just consider the constitutional scheme, take the American constitutional scheme of the three-branch government, the three-branch state, it's not obvious who the agent should be. Who should do this work of resolving an evil that is both localized and structural? It seems that it shouldn't be the legislature, because the legislature should deal with general rules. It shouldn't deal with localized situations. If it's dealing with localized situations, it's in the direction of what the Americans call the bill of attainder. It's a legislative solution to an individualized problem. That's unconstitutional. On the other hand, it's not clear that it should be either the executive or the administrative agency subordinate to the executive, because they are not legitimated or equipped to restructure anything. They're supposed to apply the law. And what about the judiciary? Well, the judiciary is designed to deal with individualized situations of wrong, but it's not designed to restructure anything. It's not designed to engage in this restructuring and this reshaping of social life, even or especially if the reshaping is localized. So it seems that if you consider the matter coldly, there is no part of the state that is appropriately designed, equipped, and funded to do this work of redressing an evil that is both structural and localized, which is precisely the evil that the structural injunctions are intended to redress. So who did it? The judges, the federal judges, the progressive federal judiciary. And now you can ask Coley, why did they do it? And the fundamental answer seems to be that they did it because they wanted to do it, and because no one else was doing it. So they did it. So there are a number of branches of government, or parts of the state. You could say none of them is ideally suited or equipped to do this work. So who will do it? Whoever wants to do it. And then they focus their attention on these relatively peripheral organizations and areas of practice. Prisons, insane asylums, even school systems. The organizations where relatively marginal and powerless groups are. Now, it's not clear what the logic is by which this practice of complex enforcement of the structural injunctions should be confined to the periphery of social life. Why should it be addressed to the periphery? Why not keep going to the central social and economic organizations? Why, for example, instead of intervening in an asylum, why didn't they intervene in Citigroup? Well, they didn't. And so there's no logic to this. So you could say, on this thesis that I'm proposing, that they went as far as they could, as they were allowed to, until they ran out of power and political will. Yes?
So maybe just to push back a little bit, I feel like there is a logic where you've identified some of sort of like the most egregious areas and examples of abuse, and that it affects sort of a discrete population, whereas maybe the idea is that, sure, you need to like urgently stop that, and maybe there's not that many people that care about the issue, whereas when it comes to Citigroup, maybe that's something that democracy should be coming together and choosing to regulate or improve or whatever. It's no secret what's happening in Citigroup, really.
Well,
like the New
for
York,
example,
right?
so take an issue of economic dualism, the division in the labor market between the primary sector and the secondary sector. So there's precarious employment. And in precarious employment, the problems of subjugation or exclusion are much greater. And the temporary, unstable workers who are caught in the secondary part of the labor market are also the victims of a form of exclusion or subjugation from which they too cannot readily escape by the forms of political and economic action available to them. So by the logic of the redress of those circumstances that subvert the effective enjoyment of rights, that too should be the object of attention.
But would you bucket the state of California's lawsuit against Tesla in that category, or is that in the asylum category or institute, right? Like, I guess I feel like there's a lot of overlap. Like, we have built out entire government agencies and processes to address some of those concerns that do affect the general public more. So if a state's bringing a lawsuit on behalf of 1,000 workers.
I guess the fundamental point I was making is that it's not obvious where the stopping point is.
Okay.
And then once you start with the peripheral organizations, you can keep going by the same logic. And there's no reason why you should select for the attention of complex enforcement or structural organizations only these relatively powerless organizations. You could keep going. Now, one of the reasons why we keep going is the complication of the causal nexus. So the idea is you're invading the causal background of social life in order to correct some part of the causal background to the evil. Now, if there's a bad school system, for example, racial discrimination may be part of the causal background. But another part of the causal background may be class injustice and the dualism of the labor market and so forth, or the hierarchy of residential opportunities in the country. So once you start to invade the causal background, the tissue of social life begins to unravel, and in many possible ways. And you could press on one side or you could press on another side. And so the superficial enigma is why you stop at one point rather than stop at another point. But I think that the deeper enigma is why you stop at this point of conceiving what you're doing as simply fixing the insult to the practical enjoyment of the right, rather than prefiguring some other way of organizing. Because the different ways of addressing the subversion of a right always anticipate, in principle, different ways of organizing something. That's the larger point, or that's the deeper enigma. So the structural injunctions stop before that point. Now, just one more issue to show the complication of this idea. So the procedural framework, this new form of adjudication, you could say there are two principles that you might apply. Two ways of thinking about the relation between substantive law and the procedural framework. One principle would be to say, if the law gives you a substantive mandate to do something, to avoid subjugation or to prevent the subversion of the exercise of a right, you should carry out that mandate. Whether or not there is an appropriate institutional agent. So whether or not the judiciary or the administrative agency or some other part of the current state is well equipped and legitimated to deal with that problem. That would be one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is to say, if the law gives you a substantive mandate like an anti-subjugation mandate. You should carry out the substantive mandate only to the extent that there is an institutionally adequate agent to do it. In other words, the substantive mandate is not enough. There has to be also institutional propriety or adequacy. There has to be the right agent. So there are two conditions and not one. Now, what has happened? How are we to make sense of what has happened? It seems that both of these principles have been applied. And the difference between them has been split in a way that you have to say is arbitrary. You take these two principles, one says, carry out the mandate of substantive law, regardless of whether there's an adequate institutional agent. And the other opposing principle, the counter principle, says, carry out the mandate of substantive law only to the extent that there's the right agent for it. If there isn't the right agent for it, it's not appropriate, it's not constitutional. And so this seems to be some splitting of the difference between these two ideas. There's no logic to it, except the brute logic of power. So you could say the hyper-rationalization of the substantive law is leading to a de-rationalization of the procedural framework. The procedural framework, the system of institutional roles, does not provide the right agent to exercise the mandate. So, you do what you can. Now, just as a matter of political reality, of course, no contemporary society, no contemporary democracy would allow the unelected judges to be on a roving sensorial mission, reshaping all sorts of areas of social practice in the name of these large ideals imputed to the law, like anti-subjugation. So they are confined to these relatively peripheral organizations. And if you ask why those and not others, and why do they stop, the answer seems to be because that's as much as they could get away with for a while they had that power, before the empire struck back, before the progressive judges were brought back to heel, and so forth. So, so what's the meaning of all of this? So the meaning is that there's a paradoxical relation between this dominant style of legal analysis and the preservation or subversion and transformation of the established institutional order. So this style of legal analysis is not entirely bereft of institutional consequences. It does motivate, it does inform this ambitious practice of finding areas of contradiction between the law and particular areas of social practice or particular organizations. What I'm calling the evils that are structural but localized. But under restraints. So it doesn't permit the generalization of this practice, and it doesn't cross a crucial bridge. The bridge is the bridge from when you're just looking to remove the immediate insult to the practical enjoyment of the right, to the position in which you say, the way in which you understand and redress the insult to the practical enjoyment of the right anticipates, it foreshadows alternative ways of organizing that part of social reality. And that just seems to be the case as a matter of logic. There's no single way of redressing the evil. It depends on your causal analysis. And the causal analysis could lead you to think you're not going to solve the problem of inadequate education if you focus just on racial discrimination and you don't focus, for example, on class injustice or on economic dualism. So they lead you in different directions. Now, it stops, of course. This form of adjudication stops before it crosses that bridge. Yes?
Do you think there could be sort of different interpretations of a legal mandate? So I feel like, you know, maybe they're not pushing forward because even within the judicial system, people see the mandates differently. They don't agree on one particular problem or contradiction. They see it differently. So there's counterforce within the judicial system that don't allow them to, you know, have a systematic change or propose anything that's really structural.
I'm not sure I understand. So are you saying that there's a debate within the legal
Right, so
elite?
let's say if there is education, you know, some of it sees it, some
Yes.
people would acknowledge that there is racial injustice, while there are people in the judicial system and also it's not, they find it controversial, but they don't think so. Because I feel like when we talk about, you know, if law gives you a substantive mandate, we're saying that it's as if it's clear that there is a substantive mandate from law, but
Well, the substantive mandate is the result of this intellectual and transformative ambition, right? You're ratcheting up your interpretation of the law. You say the law is against discrimination, it's against segregation. So you're imputing these very large ideals to the law. And it's the attribution of those large ideals which makes possible the contradiction between the law interpreted in that way and the particular areas of social practice. And that's then what leads to this problem, which is presented in the practice of the structural injunctions. Yes.
So in the 1970s in Boston, where the federal court instituted forced busing, which is something that should have been generally a local issue, local government issue, it shows that they actually did do that. And the pushback, unfortunately, against the federal court system and that lasted for decades.
Yes, what would be the political push?
Political push.
Yeah, so I mean, if one were to put this in the context of American history, recent American history, it's very clear what happened. Just from the standpoint of an empirical political narrative. The American progressives, at a certain point in their evolution, felt that they had failed, that they were unable to get from the people the support for their program. And they then attempted to circumvent political politics for a certain period through judicial politics. So they wanted to use the federal judiciary as a way of bypassing the popular veto on their proposals. And they did that for a while, but there's no alternative to political politics. And so, as I said, the empire struck back and they were brought back to heel. So this can only be an interlude. So that would be the political context in which this happened. Huh? But what I'm focusing on in this argument is the legal logic of this. That is, what I'm saying is, this contradiction between the law and a particular organization or area of social practice is only possible because we have this ambitious, idealizing view of law. And we're able to impute to the law these large ideals of anti-subjugation or anti-discrimination. That's what makes possible the conflict. And that's what in turn leads to this idea of a form of judicial redress, which requires what I was calling an invasion of the causal background of social life. But once you start to invade the causal background of social life, one thing leads to another, because one cause is connected to another cause, so you could keep going. You could keep going not just from one organization to another, but from one cause to another. From the narrow form causes of economic discrimination to the causes of economic injustice and so forth. And that's where you cross the bridge between identifying and removing an impediment to the practical enjoyment of a right and prefiguring an alternative form of organization, of something. Now, no contemporary democracy is going to allow the judges to be in charge of determining what the alternative forms of organization are. So this certainly won't be right for the judges. But what one could say as the desired outcome of this arbitrary splitting of the difference between the two principles that I described. If there's a mandate of substantive law and carry it out whether or not there's the right institutional agent, or if there's a mandate of substantive law, carry it out only to the extent that there's an appropriate agent. You would say, what happens and what should happen in history is that the right agent never exists beforehand, but temporarily the agent who wants to do it does it incongruously or imperfectly, as in this case of the structural injunctions, until you design the right agent. So in other words, we have to imagine that there would be another branch of the state, another power of the state that would be explicitly designed, equipped, and legitimated and financed to do this work of change that was structural but localized. We have to change the Constitution. We have to create the agent. And then there would be an agent equipped cognitively as well as financially, technically, to do this work of selective intervention. That agent doesn't exist in the established state. So that agent would have to be created, as it were, retrospectively. Yes?
So, I know in the comparative world of constitutional law, there's an increasing focus on so-called fourth branch institutions, which perform some kind of role outside of the three branches and are constitutionally mandated and funded. Do you see examples of institutions anywhere in the world that are carrying out the kind of role you have in mind?
You mean outside the judicial system?
Right, I mean, I'm talking about, parts of the world where ombudspersons are constitutionally mandated or public defenders or whatever it is. I'm just wondering whether what you're proposing is something you've seen approximated anywhere in the world.
I don't think that in the contemporary democracies we have any clear example of a power or a branch of government designed, equipped, and legitimated to do this work that is both localized and structural. I don't think that exists. But you could say that in different countries it exists to different extents. So that in some contemporary democracies, it might be that some form of the public administration, rather than of the judges, is more equipped to do that. Yes?
So I know you highlighted the fact that, both the structural and the localized component, but going back to some of the previous lectures and talk about low energy democracies, particularly in the United States,
Yes.
I'm wondering if we even have structural, like an agent, that's legitimated to do it, but is not actually equipped, given our particular constitutional structure, to achieve the kinds of structural change you're talking about, absent crisis situations.
Well, how could there be? I mean, of course, the legislature is legitimated to do structural change. But we think the conventional way of thinking is that it is dangerous and unconstitutional for the legislature to design solutions for particular situations. So that's the Bill of Attainder. So the legislature acts through general rules. That's part of our conception of the rule of law. Now, if one of the principles of the renovation of the state is that the state should be able to act experimentally, to try things out with respect to a certain class of situations or of people before it generalizes the solution, then there would already be a limit to that idea, as we would then begin to change. But we haven't really done that yet. So that would be a significant change.
I mean, for example, in the context of voting rights law, we have a system that allowed for a set of rules for a particular part of the country who had exhibited patterns of racially discriminatory behavior. And then the Supreme Court in part constitutionalized the requirement of equalizing treatment among the states absent like extraordinary circumstances and struck that regime down. And so I'm wondering to the extent to which what we're seeing is attempts to tamp down on the solutions that you're proposing, currently, that's currently happening in court right now. And if we're facing
it could be, because there's a tremendous advantage, of course, to this ability to act experimentally. There are tremendous practical reasons for it. And certainly, for example, in the European Union, there's a practice called the open method of coordination, which is this use of administrative action as a way to experiment, that is, to do things in stages or in parts before the solution is generalized. But I think what interests me most isn't all the stuff about it being arbitrary, although I think it is arbitrary. Which organizations, which practices, why stop here rather than stop there? There's not much rhyme or reason in any of this. I think, to me, the most significant thing is what I call the bridge. Is that this whole idea stops at a certain point. And it stops in its investigation of the impediments to the exercise of these rights. The practical enjoyment of rights, the characteristic concern of 20th century law, as I said. Why does it stop there? Because logically, the question of removing impediments to the practical exercise of rights leads into the next question, which is, what are the alternative ways of organizing this part of social reality? That's the fundamental bridge. That's what 20th century law isn't designed to do. And because then the question of institutional indeterminacy would be superseded by the more profound question of institutional pluralism, the different ways of organizing the reality of it. And as I said, we wouldn't allow judges to be the masters of that. We wouldn't want the courts to be the ones that decide what are the alternative ways of organizing society. But this would be the task of legal thought, in some sense, although not of the judges. because legal thought deals with the institutional details. Yes.
So the discussion about busing in the Voting Rights Act, I understand that that's a very much outside in approach. They're trying to fix a localized, a systemic, but a specific series of localized problems from the outside in. And I understand why in this context of discrimination, segregation, it was perceived to need to be an outside in problem, but isn't there two ways of looking at any localized problem? Is there's either a groundswell, localized subsidiary, or you have to have someone go outside in. And so there's two ways of maybe approaching this problem: a series of small localized experimentation that then you can maybe scale, or you have an outside in approach. So that would be the inside out approach. Or you have the outside in approach where you have a series of, you try to maybe scale federal government resources to fix a series of problems, and see which one works. So there's almost two approaches to it, right? And so I think we're talking mostly about the more outside in approach, but isn't there ways to foster inside out approaches at the localized level?
Well, but who does the restructuring under what you're calling the inside-outside approach? Are you saying the restructuring is done locally by local government?
I think it's a big deal, twofold. So one, you have to have experimentation at the local level, and then the other fold is that there needs to be some kind of structural protection to allow it to actually go without outside forces coming in and preventing that experimentation. Because what I see right now is even if local or even state governments want to experiment, I feel like people would use the court system to potentially hinder it through injunctions or all other kind of things. So
of course. So there are very strict limits on local experimentalism, on devolution.
Right.
In these current forms of democracy. And there are good reasons to restrain them, because the idea is that local deviations can be used, they have been used. This was the old American argument about states' rights, to entrench group privileges, to persecute certain groups, to privilege certain elites and so forth. But at the same time, you have to imagine that the only way to progress is to experiment. So, one of the characteristics of what I would call a high-energy democracy, a democracy that is fertile in the creation of structural alternatives, and that is less dependent on crisis to be the enabling condition of change. One of the characteristics is to be able to combine a facility for strong initiative by the central government with radical devolution. So, and the conventional premise is that these are the opposites. Either the center has power or the periphery has power. But it's not true, because you can imagine any set of a large range of constitutional schemes under which, depending on how you organize the divided and the concurrent powers in a federation or in a unitary state, you can combine strong central initiative with radical devolution. And cooperative federalism, vertical cooperation among the three levels of the federation, and horizontal cooperation among the states and the towns, is the first stage of experimentalism in a federal system. The second stage is when you create a system that allows parts of a country to apply for rights of very wide divergence from the dominant solutions. So it's easier to think about this in the context of a unitary state, like the United Kingdom or France. That was an example that I gave in an earlier discussion about. So the United Kingdom can make a deal with Scotland different from the deal that it makes with Wales. Because in a unitary state, there isn't the assumption that all parts of the country must enjoy simultaneously the same level of right of divergence. So long as you impose this principle that the right of divergence has to be the same, it must be very limited. If you're going to have wide divergence, you have to allow parts of a country to diverge more than other parts, exceptionally. But you have to vet the exercise of these rights, both politically and judicially, to prevent abuse. Now, why is this all so important? It's important because of the following circumstance. We contemporaries, have like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to acknowledge the primacy of structural solutions over non-structural solutions. So, structural problems require structural solutions. And so structural solutions have primacy. So for example, all economic changes, institutional changes that influence the primary distribution of advantage and disadvantage have primacy over corrective redistribution. When we think, one thing is to change the market. The other thing is to try after the fact to correct the inequalities the market generates through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. The first class has priority over the second class. That's what we have reason to think. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we also have reason to resist dogmatic, institutional, or structural blueprints. These liberals and socialists of the 19th century, all had their dogmas. Every sect said, this is the solution. All you have to do is to establish this dogma or that dogma, and then you'll be both free and rich. So we have an unprecedented problem, a problem without historical precedent, which is how we can come to recognize the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. So this experimentalism that we're talking about is responsive to that ambition. Because the aim of this democratic experimentalism is to allow us to find the way, building the way, to find the way on the way, rather than to pre-commit ourselves to a dogmatic institutional outcome. That's the significance of this. And it's in that light that all these arguments, like the little example of the structural injunctions, are so interesting. Yes?
So I have two questions.
Yes.
The first is kind of a pushback on the idea that experimentation on its own does not imply that we then actually account for the experiments and choose the best solution based on the experiments and apply it nationally. So for instance, we in this room could easily design a healthcare system that is far better than the healthcare system we currently have in the United States. We're looking at other healthcare systems around the world, and yet it doesn't happen. And it's not because for a lack of experimentation. It's for other political and social reasons, and maybe institutional reasons. So I guess that's my first question is kind of how do you create a system that not only perpetuates experimentation, but also perpetuates the use of those experiments to
There's no alternative to experience the collective learning. what a Democrat believes is that the antidote to the failures of politics is more politics. So it's just by experience that one would learn. But the idea behind this principle of, in this case, federalist experimentation, going back to your proposal about movement from the inside and from the outside, is a society goes down a certain road. But then in going down a certain road, it hedges its bets, allowing parts of itself to create alternative, tangible models of the national future. That's the reason for this experimentation. So instead of just discussing abstract doctrines, we have before us tangible examples of different ways of organizing things. And the whole of national life then becomes this dialectic between alternatives. There's a dominant road and a dominant solution, but then there's a concert of voices, of opposing voices. That's what we imagine. And so I think that's what this is about. Now, yes.
Yeah, I guess like when I hear sort of the idea of maybe like working local outward or allowing for experimentation, it's hard to give credit to an example like the UK dealing with Scotland or Wales, because it would seem that, at least in the US context, all that it's going to mean is this further subjugation of certain groups' rights, and I feel that we see that in our national sort of discourse, and you can look at it from either end of the spectrum, whether it's you don't have maybe the right to access a gun the way that you think you should in New York, and you don't have the right to access bodily autonomy or the right to vote in certain other states in the South. And so it's hard to see how experimentation doesn't always just suppress minorities on the local level, and that therefore that's what the federal government is there to do. And so as long as there is a federal government, that's going to be used as a bludgeon to try to coerce all local actors to agree one way or the other, and I think that we see that.
I understand.
Play out.
This is what it's meant in the American context. Now give me just a minute and I'll be right back.
Nice like counterexamples. So yes, I mean I've spent like a good chunk of my career arguing that Arizona shouldn't be allowed to do stuff on the local level and the federal government should, but like there's also, you know, California, San Francisco, and other jurisdictions have been sued by, you know, the federal government or other local agents for sanctuary policies or like expanding rights. And so there's not that I can
I don't think you can do too much question.
the answer, but there are efforts in like progressive localism, you know, for expansion of voting practices to traditional history, including New York.
He also says that it's like here with uses, like maybe in general.
Well, in general, I agree with you, like
Still
there are examples
You
of
can still
those
respond
that you know,
So,
you
can do
some of the things.
Two responses.
Right, but I guess like
I think that's
those
like,
states and areas too are suppressing rights from somebody else's perspective, where you're not allowed to do X, Y, or Z thing. California, Texas, these workers or whatever it is, you know, like,
Yeah.
so I think that that's how people see it, and so then when they look to the federal government, they want to, or even just to limit people's rights, right, like, if you want to stop access to, you know, safe abortion, you're going to the federal government for local areas, you know, expanding access to healthcare, and that way, you're gonna say, oh, but like, actually, I don't get
suppose you could, but that would just be like what
as
response.
a violation of.
It gets
two different
X, Y, and Z.
That he has.
But I mean, can you say that true about like the expansion of sanctuaries?
Oh, I see what you're saying,
Like,
two different
what
classes.
would be the
Yeah, you could do two responses.
diminution of
That's a good
rights?
question, actually.
Or what would be the argument that that's a diminution of rights?
I'm sure.
No, I think it's fine, I'm just saying, once you're in that model, you're opening up
Oh,
to
But not
the
too
abuse
much.
of somebody's
Should also
rights in
respond.
a very
If he wants to
sort of
switch.
extreme way, it's local.
absolutely, yeah, it's in like.
So I'm not saying that those places don't ever expand rights, like, I think, you know, you could frame limiting the guns as expanding their own safety, but
So there's a menacing history of the use of states' rights in the United States to impose forms of subjugation. And so obviously, this ability of part of a country to create a countermodel of the national future would have to be limited doubly. It would have to be approved by the political branches of government, and then would have to be vetted judicially by the legal elite to prevent discrimination. But I don't think that if it's properly controlled, it doesn't amount to a reason to suppress experimentalism. Because how else are we going to discover what the road is? Yes?
But I guess it seems to me it ties into the arbitrary idea, which I know you're saying is not the focus, but to me it doesn't, I think we can agree on a baseline of rights, which is sort of this idea of the federal government stepping in and maybe being overcorrective in some ways, but where we're saying that women and minorities are not accessing a baseline of equal employment opportunity, the right to vote, and bodily autonomy, and you can list it. But I think like on the sort of class sector, which I think it's almost inextricably linked, but we hopefully have an expanding list of rights where, I don't think 3 decades ago or more it was a popular idea that healthcare was a right. Like maybe that's wrong, but I'm not sure that's true. I think, in 10 years, maybe we'll consider giving people a phone a right. Maybe people think that way now, but I think it seems much more the realm of certain decision makers, which I think is the point you're making about why we're not going to let judges make those decisions in a world of limited resources, but just removing the barriers to participation for certain groups who have been historically purposely put in a box.
Yeah, but I think what the problem is, in this way of thinking and talking, is that it's like the Whiggish view of American history. So you're taking the perspective of the main line, which there's an order, there's an economic and political order, and certain groups are disadvantaged or underrepresented in that main order. And then you deal with that, and you deal with it through federal power. That's the bet that the American progressives have made. But what about if the problem is the order, the economic order? So, for example, take a characteristic problem now of the American economy. There's a new advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy. And instead of deepening and spreading throughout the production system, it's confined in every sector to a series of insular vanguards that exclude the vast majority of workers and businesses. The whole middle part of the job structure has sunk with the decline of industrial mass production, and there's this new advanced form of production, which is a series of fringes, of socially exclusive fringes. So this is a fundamental problem of the contemporary societies, the hierarchical organization of the structure of production. And it's not good enough to say the problem is that women are underrepresented or blacks are underrepresented or something. The problem is the structure. How do we organize a knowledge economy for the many? We don't know how to do that. And to do that, we need to experiment.
But why can't it be two-part? I guess I'm just not conceding that that's not the vision that already exists, because I feel like a lot of people think, well, let's get everyone equal, and then from there, we can do all those things. But because the systems have changed, no matter what they are, or how you identify them, or however you reallocate, has to be based in a reality with a history, you can never do it fairly unless you have a baseline of equality and participation. Sure. I think most people would agree, maybe in this moment, if every American could vote, we could say, oh, we're gonna shake up the world and shake up the resources and shake up the jobs, and you could do great, or whatever, sort of original position style. Maybe they'd agree and buy into that. But because that's not how change is ever gonna happen, it seems like you do have to address the history in the first piece, because there's no other way that we're gonna
Well, of course
reallocate
we have to
resources
address
and
the
power.
history, but, so I gave an example, which I think is a fundamental example of its own importance of the nature of production. So it's barely an exaggeration to say that what happens in the country is that there's an elite in control of this new economic vanguard. Everyone else in the country is consigned to some form of make work. Now, how are we going to change that? And it's fine to say, well, we'll have this discourse about all groups having equal rights and so forth. But that doesn't include this project of deepening and disseminating the knowledge economy. So that did happen earlier in American history. An equivalent to that is in the early 19th century, between the independence and the Civil War, the Americans didn't just have a developmental project on top, the Hamiltonian project of national mobilization, of opening up the country. They had selective democratization of what were then the two most important sectors of the American economy, agriculture and finance. They organized a family-scale farming with entrepreneurial characteristics that had never existed before in the world. That wasn't the regulation of the agricultural market, that was the creation of an agricultural market that had never existed before. That kind of project, I think, can't be done on a blueprint. It requires this experimentation. And now applied to this formidable issue of the knowledge economy and its dissemination and deepening. That's, I think, what's the empirical background to this. So,
But to his point, sorry, forgetting your name, but about the best experiments don't necessarily rise to the top. I think like the American model, or even the sorts of models you're discussing, is that there's some sort of competition that weeds out the best ideas and kind of like highlights them, and the cream rises to the top. But because there are all these sort of structural inequalities on the way, that's not necessarily true. So like, how do you address both at the same time?
It's not just the structural inequalities. So just take that model that I gave of the early 19th century. So there's the developmental state on top, and there's the selective democratization below. And so why was that model not reproduced later in American history? Why did it become progressively weaker? I think for two main reasons. One political and the other intellectual. The political reason is the weakness of democracy. The Americans had organized a proto-democratic liberalism, not what I'm calling a high-energy democracy. And it gave the predominant voice to the property classes, to an elite of notables who control the republic. The Constitution had been designed to inhibit the transformation of society by politics. And then there was the intellectual reason that the idea that the market order can take radically different forms was not made explicit. There was no doctrine, and there's no doctrine. And so the American idea was limited and subverted by this element of institutional idolatry. A free society has a natural form. The market has a natural form, which is the main idea of the Americans in economic life. And I don't think you attack that or undermine it simply by advantaging all these other groups in the same structure, that exists. There's how do you get to another structure? So I think it is it's a powerful incitement to the creation of structural alternatives to have this multiplicity of voices. But the multiplicity of voices by itself doesn't get you there without this combination of thought and politics.
I guess though, it seems like an argument could be that we want to throw out this model of the market because maybe there's some ideal alternative, and yet we haven't actually tried the best version of this because there are certain inequalities stopping that. Like, for example, when we had massive redistribution programs passed, like I think those have been highlighted as great times for the country and great policy experiments and a lot of investment in all sorts of people and communities, and that doesn't happen now because some people want to do it, but not enough of the people in power want to do it. So it seems early to say, well, this project doesn't work or this isn't a good way of the market, when we really haven't done a lot of the ideas that are on the table.
Well, now we're broadening out the discussion to a programmatic discussion about the alternatives in the United States, right?
Well,
so isn't it true that the dominant idea of the American progressives are, so let's take a very simple proposition. The United States has no strategy of economic growth. The only strategy of economic growth in the United States can be summarized in 2 words: cheap money. So it's expansionary monetary policy, mass consumption, and debt and credit. That's the economic strategy of the United States. The progressives have no approach to the supply side. They have an approach only to the demand side of the economy. And the content of an approach to the supply side isn't obvious. It has to come from somewhere. So there's this epistemic element. You have to learn, you have to discover. And that's the sense of this democratic experimentalism, to show you how to do it. That's the kind of argument that we would have, which would change the direction of the official discourse of the progressives. The progressives, it seems, in the United States would like the United States to become more like Sweden, like this imaginary Sweden of the 1970s. But there's no productivist project in the United States. And the productivist project requires an institutional imagination. That's the object of this. That's the reward at the end of the day of this discourse. So I don't think we disagree about the importance of these advantages of the equal enfranchisement and empowerment of these disadvantaged groups. But what I see is that this isn't enough to shift the track and to get us into this other conversation.
But I guess it's the impetus for the track that I'm missing, to the extent that we haven't tried.
The impetus, but the motivation for it is overwhelming. So just take this issue of the insular knowledge economy. What are its consequences? First of all, economic stagnation, and stagnation in the rise of productivity. And how could there not be economic slowdown in societies that deny to the majority of the population the most advanced practice of production? So that's one incentive. To be rich, to be prosperous, to prosper, to flourish. Now, the second is economic inequality. So if the economic inequality is anchored in the hierarchical structure of the production system, and if a huge chasm opens up, separating the vanguard from the rear guard, no amount of retrospective or corrective redistribution is going to fix that, because the corrective redistribution would have to be massive in order to address those inequalities. The structural problem requires a structural solution. Now, and so then we come back to this discussion how can we have structural solutions which are not contaminated, tainted by these dogmatic preconceptions? That's the discussion.
Right, all I'm saying is I just feel like we haven't tried the massive redistribution option. Yeah, but you're
There can't be a massive redistribution option. I disagree with you, because if the distribution, there's been no modern society has had such a massive redistribution. The redistribution would have to be massive. And if the redistribution is contrary to the logic of the established economic arrangements and incentives, it exacts an unacceptable cost in foregone economic output. So that's the point. The point is not that you shouldn't redistribute. The point is that the solutions that influence the primary distribution of economic advantage and disadvantage, that is the original distribution of income and opportunity, have absolute causal primacy over all the solutions that influence the secondary distribution of advantage and disadvantage. That is, they take the established order as given, and they say, but then we'll correct it all. So it will generate a certain distribution, and then after the fact, we'll make another distribution. That doesn't work, because then you create this conflict between the economic motor and the sequel. So you need to build the logic of equalization and inclusion into the production system. And that's a different kind of task. That's not a task of correction. And that's a task for the execution of which no one has the formula. I think that's what's in question here.
Only if you view the redistribution, though, as something that's set and not something that closes the gap. Because otherwise you do need the second redistribution, you need the third, but each time it's less because ideally you're empowering the workforce.
I'm sorry, I don't agree with you empirically. I think that's just false. So this is the false idea that the Americans have, for example, about the European social democracy. So they think, for example, the Scandinavian social democracies are equal because they have these redistributive social entitlements. That's false. In Sweden, there were 8 decades of conflict between the social democratic state and the familial plutocracies that control the Swedish economy. And it ended in a compromise. And then the system of redistributive entitlements came afterwards, after this compromise had established. So it was, as it were, the epilogue to this narrative. So the Americans imagine that they can have the epilogue without having the narrative. There has to be this conflict over the basic arrangements that shape the original distribution. And then the corrective redistribution has a complementary role in extending it, and is especially efficacious with respect to the level of investment in people and their capabilities. So, for example, one of the characteristics of these social democracies is, what's their greatest historical achievement? Their greatest historical achievement is to have sustained a high level of investment in people and their capabilities, paradoxically financed by the regressive taxation of consumption, as in the flat rate value-added tax. So I would say that if you look at the budget as a whole, on both the revenue-raising side and the spending side, what matters most for the redistributive effect in the short term is not how progressive the tax system is on the revenue-raising side. It's the aggregate level of the tax taken, how it's spent. So the fundamental practical reason why the budget is much more progressive in the European social democracies than in the United States is very simple. It's that the European states take in more than 10% higher of GDP in taxes than the Americans. And then they spend it redistributed. So that everything that's lost by way of progressivity on the revenue raising side of the budget is gained in double on the spending side. But that only works if it complements an equalization which is achieved in the primary distribution of advantage, that is the structure of the democratization of opportunity. You can't replace a prejudicial original distribution by a massive correction, because you can't cancel everything that the market did and expect to be successful. I think that's the fundamental problem. Now, if someone here had a point to make, okay. Yes?
I think it's moving tracks in a different direction. So we're talking about some regional evolution, but there's also some sense of sectoral evolution. You can track to operate in specific areas of the economy nationally. And I do feel that there was some sense of experimentation. To give an example to the aerospace studies. Antitrust, the US did give some leeway to the FTC. Now it's still subsumed by the Sherman Act, so there's still some legal over.
Yes.
But one of the challenges I see in that structure, even this limited change, is that there is some sense of something similar to regulatory capture, but more like a cultural capture. People that work on FTC are people, for the most part, that were formed in schools where they absorb the economic sense from these systems, and those are the people charged with implementing it. And then the naive solution will say, well, then let's just train people, let's just put there people that are not trained in this, but then they lack tools to really understand what's going on to implement the change, if that makes sense. I could go to a more extreme example. The FAA is supposed to be regulating aircraft, but only engineers understand what aircraft safety is, kept to the lawyer there to do it without some engineering training, right? So how do you get out of this trap, which I really think it has to do with the fact that people that do something are people that were interested in it to begin with. It's kind of like a human thing.
But what is the problem that you're pointing to? What's the conclusion?
So it seems when there's a trap for some sectors that they want to change, that the people that have the technical ability to implement the change are subsumed by the cultural environment of that field itself. So this example is that people that were training economics are the people that like antitrust law, so that they're going to use the classic economic tools for understanding antitrust. And then, so they wouldn't be the people that would implement the change that we are thinking of. They'll be still within the culture of only use antitrust, monopolies, and like not thinking monopolies in a broader sense.
But what I didn't understand is what conclusion you derive from this law and inclusion.
So my question is how to get out of that trap. How do we need like a fixed education system early? Do we need to be thinking of expanding this? It wasn't as much as a conclusion as much as there's a problem I don't know how to get out of. I don't know if the problem is clear.
For our purposes here, the focus of the inquiry is the difference between solutions that are institutional or structural and solutions that aren't. So, for example, think of this question of, you mentioned the example of antitrust, of using antitrust as a panacea to disrupt the platform oligopolies in the United States. But of course, a large part of the social value, as well as of the economic or market value of the platform oligopolies, lies in the universality of their platform. So if you simply broke them up, you would disrupt this value. Not just the value to them and their shareholders, but the value to society. That suggests that there has to be a different set of tools. of governance, of accountability, of representation, of innovations in the law of international, of intellectual property. So for example, one of the presuppositions that allows the platform oligopolies to do their business is a loophole in the law of intellectual property. They've discovered a way to make money out of the use of the data of their customers for free. They pay nothing for it. And they have a series of other advantages. So that requires a different way of thinking. Now, that way of thinking can't be deduced from general economic theory. It has to do with practical and institutional design, in which we imagine different structures of governance, different forms of intellectual property law, and we have to be able to try it out to see what it looks like in practice. That's the point that we're discussing here.
Right, but even in your example, fine, we need to fix IP law. Actually, I happen to be a person that worked in IP context, and until coming to this law school, I never really was out of the economic efficiency idea of why IP law exists. And people in the IP bar think that way. So my issue is not so much which specific institution should be taking care of which problem, but more the human resource angle of implementing any structural change.
But there's no magic solution to that, right? The solution is education.
Right, and that's
and what is education? Education is transcendence of our social circumstance. So, Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal thought of himself as a radical experimentalist. And at least for the first year and a half of the New Deal, he said he was willing to try anything. And he assembled around him a large range of voices. But if you look at the content of what he did in the early New Deal, it was very narrow. It consisted in labor fronts, that is the government, the state hired people who were unemployed. And the main institutional focus was concerted action between big business and organized labor, the restabilization of the economy. It's what in today's vocabulary we would describe as corporatism. Now, why did Roosevelt gravitate to that? It's for a very simple reason, because those were the only ideas that were available to him at that time. Those were the dominant ideas at the beginning of the 1930s. And if you look at the detailed programs of the New Deal, although the Americans don't want to hear this, they were very similar to the early economic programs of the Hitler regime. Because these were, why? Because those were the ideas that were available. So all these people are at the mercy of the ideas that they know. Ideas don't arise because you want them. So this is the characteristic illusion of the politicians. They think that when they want the ideas will magically appear. They'll call in the advisors from the universities or whatever, and they'll have the alternatives. But the universities are the custodians of intellectual orthodoxy. So the alternatives don't. You can call them, but will they come? They won't come. That's the problem. And now, I think that what the provocation for the exercise in this seminar is that the most important ideas about society are the ideas about institutional structure. And those and institutional structure in its detailed variations and contradictions exists in law. That's where it exists. That's where we have it in its detailed form. It doesn't exist in the form of these abstractions like the market economy, capitalism, and so on. But in law, it's subservient to the objectives of the legal elite, of the legal notables, who are the judges, the courts, and so forth. And so we have to somehow find this intellectual resource there and liberate it from its narrow context so they can have this larger use. That's the premise of our inquiry here in the seminar. So it's interesting, I had started today's class with the idea that this discussion of complex enforcement would be only the preamble, but I stopped at the preamble, as often happens. So we'll continue next time, but do come to me with your ideas about your papers. See you next time. Oh, actually, wait a minute. There's more time, right? It's 3:45. I get constantly confused because this was originally scheduled to meet from 1:30 to 3:30. So we have a few more minutes. So let me begin with what I had intended during the second stage, and just set the stage for another kind of discussion. So, behind these arguments that we're having about the contemporary form of legal discourse, rationalizing purpose of legal analysis in the vocabulary of policy and principle, there are these two large themes in the history of legal thought, worldwide. So this principle-based, policy-oriented, purposive style of legal analysis is simply the most recent version of what would be called legal doctrine. And it's law in the hands of the professionals, the professional experts. As opposed to law as the outcome of regulated conflict among organized groups, law as it arises out of politics and legislation. So that distinction between law in the hands of the interpreters as doctrine and law coming out of politics as legislation is the contemporary form of a very universal and ancient contrast between two themes in the universal history of legal thought. Two ideas of law, law as doctrine and law as the will of the sovereign. Whoever has power decides. And behind these arguments that we're having is a fundamental conflict between these two ideas of law. Law as doctrine and law as the will of the sovereign. They're contradictory. And all of the problems of legal theory, the traditional problems of legal theory, have to do with in one way or another, with the difficulty of reconciling these two ideas. Now, not only are they contradictory, but they are incomplete. Because there's a third idea of law, which is law as the real structure of society. The real structure of society, unacknowledged, unjustified, unexplained, is the third element. Law as will, law as the will of the sovereign, is in fact a series of localized episodic interventions in this received structure of society. And law as doctrine only makes sense when seen against the implicit background of the actual structure. Now, I want to elaborate on this idea of law as doctrine. So what is doctrine? And the concept of doctrine, legal doctrine, or doctrine generally, has become almost inaccessible, unintelligible to us. It has no contemporary epistemological status. It has no established role in contemporary culture. And what is it? In the major civilizations of the past was the highest form of discourse. So in the Roman Digest, jurisprudence is defined as the science of all things human and divine. And so it's the conception of the organization of social life as an intelligible and defensible plan. And you can imagine it as a series of pictures, of images, of what the relations among people can and should look like in different domains of social life. And what are the methodological characteristics of what I'm calling doctrine? Which we would also find in other doctrinal disciplines like theology and grammar. Theology by opposition to the sociology of religion, and grammar by opposition to scientific linguistics. So first, the discourse of doctrine is not separate from its subject matter. It is constitutive of its subject matter. So, theology is part of religion. It formulates the religious creed. Doctrine formulates the reality of law. It's not a doctrine about something that's separate from itself. It is partially constitutive of the subject matter. And in this respect, it's completely unlike the discourse of natural science. The discourse of natural science is about a subject matter that's separate from itself. The second characteristic is that if the discourse is inseparable from the subject matter in doctrine, the subject matter itself is divided, is two-dimensional. It consists in a series of symbols, and underlying these symbols are deeper meanings that are mediated through the symbols. So, in the case of legal doctrine, in this most recent example of the principle-oriented and policy-based style of discourse, the deeper reality is the reality of the principles and policies, and they're the image of social life, the normative picture, which is then translated in by the surface, the rules. And the third characteristic is that the moves in doctrine have a practical purpose, and they commit the power of the state as in grammar. They have a normative use and distinguishing right from wrong practice, and in theology, wrong from right belief. So this ancient conception of doctrine is the conception that the law should be viewed then as a prescriptive idea of social life. Through the lens of this discourse, this ancient and universal discourse that I'm calling doctrine, of which the purposive, rationalizing, systematizing, idealizing form is simply the most recent version. And this idea of legal thought coexists with a second idea, which is the idea that law is whatever the sovereign decides. And in a democracy, the sovereign is the majority, is the popular self-government qualified by the rights of the minority. Now, how could one get from one of these ideas to the other idea? There's no... They seem to contradict each other. They're irreconcilable. And the law that the sovereign decides, in fact, is a series of localized interventions in the received structure of society. And is that not the character of modern legislation? So, supposedly, democracy means collective deliberation, collective decision about the terms of social life. But most of the terms of social life are inherited and unquestioned. And legislation is, in fact, a series of episodic interventions in this structure. Doctrine, on the other hand, which presents this prescriptive image of social life, only makes sense when it's seen against the implicit background of what society is really like. Now, what is the future of this distinction? That's the question that I intend to ask. What's the future of the distinction between these two ideas of law? So we would say that the deeper a democracy is, the truer it would be that the terms of social life are chosen. They're not just imposed by tradition, by the past, by habit. They are the object of reflection and decision. So society makes itself through the law. On the other hand, the idea of doctrine as an intelligible and defensible plan of social life, which the jurists decant into these principle and policy ideas, wouldn't be the discovery of some pre-existing normative formula. It would also be a creation, an invention of society. So somehow the ideal limit of these two things is that they should converge. And that the normative conception of doctrine and the political conception of democracy, law as chosen, law as made, should over time move together and become the same thing. That's the ideal limit of the universal history of legal thought. The structure, the actual structure of society, rather than being just a brute fact, a dumb, unacknowledged, unexplained fact about social life, would then be the object of understanding, of explanation, and justification. And here then we come to the third element in the universal history of law. We have no usable account of the structure. So there was an account in classical European social theory, and the consummate expression of it is Marx's theory of society and history. the structures of society are made and imagined. They're not like natural objects. They're a kind of frozen fire. History is an ongoing conflict over the terms of social life, and this conflict is frozen, and the result of this freezing of the structures of social life. The temporary containment and interruption of the struggle is what creates the structures. So this insight in Marx's theory is circumscribed by a series of illusions. First, that there's a limited menu, a closed list of regimes. Marx called them the modes of production: feudalism, capitalism, socialism. Second, each of them is an indivisible system. So the consequence of that is a binary view of politics. There's either the reformist management of a system or the revolutionary substitution of one system by another. And the third assumption is the historical laws assumption. There are laws governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible regimes in history. So the problem is that these assumptions have all become literally incredible. It has become impossible to believe them. But we continue to use the vocabulary which accepts these presuppositions. So for example, capitalism, class conflict, or whatever. So how